In 2003, the rural community of Marion, Ohio, was stunned by a murder that seemed to defy all logic. The victim, 56-year-old Harold Benson, was a retired machinist who had lived in the same house on the edge of town for more than 3 decades. He was the kind of neighbor people trusted. Quiet, dependable, the man who shoveled his elderly neighbor's driveway in winter without being asked. He spent his evenings fishing at a nearby lake or watching old westerns in his living room. Harold had no enemies that anyone could name. That's why his death was not only shocking, it was nearly impossible for people to understand. One September morning, Harold was found dead in his garage by a friend who had stopped by to borrow a tool. He had been bludgeoned with a hammer, left sprawled on the concrete floor. There were no signs of forced entry. His wallet and cash remained untouched. The brutality of the attack made it clear this wasn't a burglary or a random intrusion. This was personal. Investigators quickly began looking at those close to Harold, and within a week, they focused their attention on a man who lived just 2 doors down, 24-year-old Kenneth Marks. Kenneth wasn't an obvious suspect at first. He had grown up in the neighborhood, gone to the same schools as Harold's son, and had no violent criminal history. But when police questioned him, he was evasive, his alibi didn't hold up, and soon enough, forensic evidence, traces of Harold's blood, found on Kenneth's shoes placed him at the crime scene. What truly stunned investigators, however, wasn't that Kenneth was the killer, but why he had killed. When confronted with the evidence, Kenneth confessed. His reason was so absurd, so petty, that detectives initially thought he was lying to cover up something bigger. He said he killed Harold because Harold wouldn't return his lawnmower. The story unfolded like this. Months earlier, Harold had borrowed Kenneth's lawnmower after his own broke down. According to neighbors, Harold was meticulous about tools. He always borrowed and returned equipment in good condition. But in this case, the lawnmower had broken while in Harold's care. He apologized, offered to pay for repairs, and even suggested Kenneth borrow his equipment until he could replace it. For Harold, it was a small mishap. For Kenneth, it became an obsession. Kenneth believed Harold had deliberately ruined the mower. He ranted to friends that Harold disrespected him, that the older man had never intended to return it in working order. What might have been resolved with a simple replacement or even an apology festered into a fixation. Kenneth began avoiding Harold in public, glaring at him when their paths crossed. According to witnesses, he once muttered under his breath, "He thinks he can just take from me and get away with it." By the time Harold invited Kenneth over to his garage to settle the matter, intending to hand over cash for a new mower, Kenneth's anger had boiled into violence. Instead of talking, Kenneth picked up a hammer lying on Harold's workbench and attacked. He struck him repeatedly until Harold collapsed, then left him to die on the garage floor. At trial, prosecutors emphasized the absurdity of the motive. This was not about money, they argued, nor even about the lawnmower itself. It was about pride. Kenneth couldn't accept what he saw as an insult, a slight against his dignity, and in his immaturity and anger, he turned it into a justification for murder. The lawnmower was just the symbol of something larger, his fragile ego. The defense argued that Kenneth had underlying mental health issues. A psychologist testified that he exhibited paranoid tendencies and a propensity to magnify minor slights into personal attacks. They claimed his actions were the result of untreated mental illness and impulsive rage rather than calculated malice, but the sheer brutality of the attack, combined with his attempt to deny involvement until confronted with evidence, undercut their argument. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days before finding Kenneth guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. For Harold's family, the verdict brought no sense of closure. His son spoke bitterly outside the courthouse, saying, "My father lost his life over a piece of machinery. That's all it took. A lawnmower. And for the rest of us, nothing will ever be the same." The case became a grim talking point across Ohio, a cautionary tale about how quickly petty disputes could escalate into tragedy. Neighbors who once thought of their street as safe and friendly began locking doors more carefully, watching interactions with suspicion. It was hard to reconcile the friendly retiree who had helped shovel driveways with the brutal way he was killed, and even harder to understand how something so small could spark such violence. Criminologists studying the case noted that disputes over property and perceived disrespect often form the root of violent conflict. Yet, what made Harold's murder stand out was the disproportion between the cause and the outcome. A broken lawnmower was not just trivial, it was laughable compared to the weight of a man's life, and yet in Kenneth's mind, it justified an irreversible act. Years later, when Kenneth was interviewed in prison, he showed little remorse. He spoke about the lawnmower as though it were proof of a conspiracy against him, saying Harold never intended to give it back, and that people like him think they can walk all over people like me. The chilling part wasn't just the crime itself, but the way Kenneth clung to his delusion, never acknowledging the absurdity of what he'd done. The murder of Harold Benson remains one of the most haunting examples of how petty grievances can explode into unthinkable violence. It raises a question that lingers long after the case closed. How can something so small, so trivial, become the trigger for murder? The answer lies not in the lawnmower, but in the fragile human mind that saw insult where there was none and chose blood over reason. In 2015, the small coastal town of Astoria, Oregon, became the center of a case so baffling that even seasoned investigators described it as one of the most senseless crimes they had ever encountered. The victim was 34-year-old Emily Lawson, a single mother who worked as a waitress at a local diner. Emily was known for her resilience, raising 2 children on her own while juggling long shifts at work. She was well liked in the community, remembered for her warm smile and the way she remembered her customers' names and favorite meals. She lived a modest life, but she carried herself with quiet strength. One summer evening, Emily never came home from her shift. Concerned, her babysitter called the police, and a search began. Hours later, Emily's body was discovered in a wooded area just outside town. She had been strangled, her belongings scattered nearby. The brutality of the crime stunned the community, but the motive, once uncovered, was even more staggering. The investigation quickly zeroed in on 27-year-old Jason Miller, a regular at the diner where Emily worked. Jason was unemployed, known to spend his days drifting around town drinking and venting his frustrations to anyone who would listen. He had a history of minor run-ins with the law, disorderly conduct, public intoxication, but nothing that suggested violent tendencies. Witnesses recalled seeing him at the diner the night Emily disappeared. Surveillance footage showed him lingering near the parking lot as she closed her shift. When police brought him in for questioning, his story crumbled under scrutiny. Eventually, Jason confessed to killing Emily. His reason was so absurd that detectives struggled to believe it at first. He claimed he murdered her because she forgot to put pickles on his burger. According to Jason, earlier that week, he had ordered a cheeseburger at the diner. Emily, busy during the dinner rush, accidentally left off the pickles. Jason claimed he pointed it out, and though Emily quickly corrected the mistake and apologized, he felt humiliated. He told investigators, "She laughed about it, like I was nothing." No one else recalled her laughing, but in Jason's mind, the small error became a personal insult, a deliberate slight. Over the next few days, Jason brooded. He ranted to acquaintances that Emily had disrespected him, that she thought she was better than him because she had a steady job. In reality, Emily likely forgot the incident the moment it happened, one mistake among countless meals she served each day. But Jason's fragile ego twisted it into something intolerable. By the time he confronted her outside the diner, his anger had metastasized into violence. He followed her to her car, argued with her, and when she tried to walk away, he attacked. The trial drew wide media coverage, not because of Jason's notoriety, he was a nobody, but because of the sheer pettiness of the motive. Headlines captured the disbelief of the public when mother of two killed over burger order. Prosecutors presented Jason as a man consumed by entitlement, someone so steeped in bitterness that even the smallest perceived insult justified violence in his mind. They emphasized his escalating anger, pointing to witness testimony that he had talked about getting back at Emily in the days leading up to the murder. The defense argued that Jason suffered from severe alcohol abuse and untreated mental illness. Psychiatrists testified that he exhibited signs of paranoid thinking, convinced that people were mocking him even when they weren't. They claimed the incident with the burger was simply the spark that lit a fire of long-simmering resentment, not the true cause. But the jury struggled to accept this argument when weighed against the cold facts. Jason had stalked Emily after work, attacked her, and left her in the woods. In 2017, Jason was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. At sentencing, Emily's children, ages 10 and 12, sat quietly as their grandmother spoke on their behalf. Her voice broke as she said, "My daughter lost her life over pickles. My grandchildren lost their mother over nothing. That's what we're left with, nothing." The community of Astoria reeled. Emily had been a fixture at the diner, her absence felt by everyone who had come to know her. Customers left flowers at her usual booth. Her co-workers wore pins with her name on their aprons. For weeks, the town was filled with an atmosphere of disbelief. How could something so small, so trivial become the reason for murder? Criminologists, analyzing the case later, pointed to Jason's fragile sense of self-worth. For someone already isolated, unemployed, and adrift, the perceived slight of a forgotten condiment became, in his mind, a symbol of all his failures. Emily, who had shown him no real malice, became the target of his bitterness. It was easier for him to focus his rage on her than confront the deeper reality of his wasted life. In prison interviews, Jason offered little clarity. He repeated the same story, insisting that Emily mocked him by forgetting the pickles that she had to pay for treating him that way. He showed no remorse, no recognition of the absurdity of his actions. For many, that was the most chilling part. Not just that he had killed over something so small, but that even afterward, he clung to the delusion that his actions were justified. The murder of Emily Lawson stands as one of the starkest examples of how petty grievances can be magnified into deadly motives. It forces the uncomfortable realization that not all murders stem from grand passions or calculated greed. Sometimes they come from something as simple as a bruised ego and a forgotten pickle, filtered through the warped lens of a mind unable to distinguish inconvenience from insult. For Emily's family, the result was the same: an irreplaceable life stolen, a mother gone, and a community left to grapple with a crime that made no sense at all. In 1996, the farming town of Plainview, Kansas, was shaken to its core by a murder that would leave neighbors whispering for decades. The victim was 68-year-old William Bill Hargrove, a retired farmer who still kept a small garden and a few chickens on his property. Bill was a widower, respected in the community for his work ethic and kindness. People remembered how he would deliver baskets of vegetables to neighbors in the summer or lent his tools without hesitation. To many, he was a quiet reminder of a simpler time, a man who valued honesty and hard work, which is why, when he was found shot to death in his barn one autumn afternoon, the town struggled to understand how such violence could have reached him. Bill's body was discovered by his niece, who had stopped by to drop off groceries. He had been shot twice at close range with a shotgun, the weapon discarded nearby. The scene was gruesome, but also oddly calm. Nothing appeared stolen, no signs of forced entry, no ransacked drawers. This wasn't a robbery. Whoever killed Bill had done it for reasons that went beyond money. The investigation moved quickly, and suspicion soon focused on Bill's 32-year-old neighbor, Robert Lane. Robert lived with his parents on the adjoining farm. Locals knew him as surly and quick-tempered, a man who spent more time drinking than working the land. His father often complained about him at the local bar, saying Robert never lifted a hand unless it was to take something, but nothing in Robert's past suggested he was capable of murder until the motive emerged. When questioned by detectives, Robert eventually confessed. The reason he gave stunned everyone. He said he killed Bill because Bill's rooster crowed too loudly in the mornings. To Robert, the sound of that rooster was intolerable. He claimed it woke him every day at dawn, ruining his sleep, disrupting his life. He told investigators that he had complained to Bill about it more than once, demanding that he get rid of the bird. Bill, polite but firm, had shrugged off the complaints. And that's what roosters do, he had said. They crow. It's nature. To Robert, that response felt like mockery, as though Bill was dismissing him. Over time, Robert's irritation turned into obsession. He began keeping track of when the rooster crowed, writing down the times in a notebook. He ranted to friends about how it was driving him crazy. Some remembered him joking darkly that he was going to shut that bird up for good. No one thought he was serious. But one morning, after another restless night, Robert grabbed his shotgun, walked onto Bill's property, and confronted him in the barn. Their argument escalated, and in a burst of rage, Robert pulled the trigger, not at the rooster, but at Bill himself. At trial, prosecutors emphasized the absurdity of the motive. They painted Robert as a man so consumed by petty grievance that he turned it into a justification for murder. They argued that the rooster wasn't the problem. It was Robert's inability to control his temper, his refusal to accept even the smallest inconvenience. The defense leaned on Robert's mental state. A psychologist testified that he exhibited signs of intermittent explosive disorder, a condition marked by sudden bursts of rage over trivial matters. They argued that he had acted in the heat of the moment, that he never intended to kill Bill, but the evidence suggested otherwise. Witnesses recalled hearing Robert threaten Bill in the weeks leading up to the murder, and the fact that he brought a loaded shotgun with him that morning convinced the jury this was no accident. Robert was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 40 years in prison. The courtroom was packed during sentencing, filled with neighbors who had known both men their whole lives. Many shook their heads in disbelief, unable to reconcile the image of Bill's gentle generosity with the brutal way he died. His niece spoke through tears, saying, "My uncle survived hard winters, drought, and losing his wife. He deserved peace in his final years. Instead, his life was stolen over the sound of a bird." The case haunted the community long after Robert was locked away. Farmers who had grown up around crowing roosters found it incomprehensible that such a normal sound could drive someone to kill. For them, it was part of daily life, a reminder of morning routines and long days in the fields. But for Robert, it had become a symbol of everything he hated: his failures, his frustrations, his inability to control his own circumstances. In his mind, Bill's refusal to silence the bird was an insult he couldn't bear. Criminologists later cited the case as a striking example of displaced aggression. The rooster wasn't the real source of Robert's anger. His directionless life, his dependence on his parents, and his feelings of failure were. But instead of facing those problems, he projected them onto the sound of an animal he couldn't control and onto the man who owned it. When Bill refused to bend to his demands, Robert snapped. Years later, when interviewed in prison, Robert still fixated on the rooster. He spoke of it as though it had been a personal enemy, saying, "That damn bird never shut up." Nobody knows what it's like, day after day, hearing it scream at you. When asked if killing Bill was worth it, he paused, then muttered he wouldn't listen. The lack of remorse chilled those who heard it. The murder of William Hargrove remains one of the most senseless in Kansas history. It wasn't about money, revenge, or even survival. It was about a sound, a rooster crowing at dawn, the most ordinary noise in rural life. And yet, in the wrong mind, that sound became unbearable, a spark that led to bloodshed. For those who knew Bill, the tragedy lies not only in the loss of his life, but in the sheer absurdity of its cause. A good man, taken from his family and his community, all because a neighbor couldn't bear to hear the morning call of a rooster. In 2009, the quiet suburbs of Glendale, Arizona, witnessed a crime so baffling the detectives initially struggled to believe the motive. The victim was 43-year-old Amanda Reese, a single mother of two who worked as a nurse at a local hospital. Known for her compassion and warmth, Amanda was the kind of neighbor who offered to babysit for free or bring over soup when someone was ill. Her death, violent and unexpected, sent shockwaves through the community. Amanda was found dead in her living room one evening after failing to show up for her night shift. A co-worker, concerned by her absence, drove to her house and discovered the front door ajar. Inside, Amanda lay motionless on the couch. She had been stabbed multiple times. The scene suggested no forced entry, no burglary. Her valuables, purse, wallet, jewelry were untouched. Whoever killed her had come with one purpose. Investigators soon discovered that the killer was her next-door neighbor, 27-year-old Sarah Miller. Sarah was a college dropout who lived with her boyfriend and spent much of her time online. Friends described her as quiet, withdrawn, but capable of sudden bursts of intensity. She had no history of violence, no criminal record, and no apparent grudge against Amanda. So when she confessed to the killing after being questioned, detectives pressed her for a reason. Her explanation was almost incomprehensible. She murdered Amanda because Amanda always parked her car in the wrong spot. For months, Sarah had stewed over the parking situation. Their houses shared a narrow driveway space, and though Amanda always parked legally, her car sometimes extended slightly over the invisible boundary line. To Sarah, this felt like a personal attack. She claimed Amanda was encroaching on her territory, disrespecting her, and refusing to acknowledge the inconvenience. Neighbors later testified that Sarah had complained about it constantly, ranting about how Amanda was taking up space that wasn't hers. Some thought it was harmless venting. Others recalled seeing Sarah glaring at Amanda as she carried groceries from her car. Once Sarah even left a note on Amanda's windshield, written in angry block letters, "Stay in your own space." Amanda, who friends said was gentle to a fault, laughed it off and tried to wave to Sarah afterward as though to ease the tension, but Sarah never waved back. On the night of the murder, Sarah saw Amanda pull into the driveway again. The car's back bumper edged slightly past the imaginary line Sarah had drawn in her mind. In her later confession, she described how her anger boiled over. "It was the last straw," she said. She grabbed a kitchen knife, walked next door, and entered Amanda's home through the unlocked door. Amanda, startled, barely had time to speak before Sarah attacked her in a frenzy of stabbing. At trial, prosecutors emphasized the sheer pettiness of the motive. They painted Sarah as someone who allowed a trivial annoyance to grow into a deadly obsession. The parking line became, in her mind, a symbol of disrespect, a constant reminder of grievances she couldn't let go of. When the jury heard this, some shook their heads in disbelief. How could a human life be worth less than a strip of driveway concrete? The defense argued that Sarah suffered from untreated paranoia and anger management issues, suggesting her perception of the situation was warped beyond reason. A psychiatrist testified that Sarah believed Amanda's parking habits were deliberate acts of hostility, part of a pattern of provocation she imagined. They claimed Sarah acted in a state of delusional rage, unable to distinguish reality from her own distorted narrative. But the jury was not swayed. The evidence showed clear premeditation. Sarah armed herself, entered Amanda's house, and carried out the attack. She was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Amanda's children, both teenagers, were left to grapple with the loss. At sentencing, her daughter spoke tearfully, saying, "My mom saved lives every day as a nurse. She cared for people who were sick and suffering. She gave so much. And she was taken from us over something as small as a parking space. It doesn't make sense." The case was widely covered in the media, becoming a grim example of how everyday conflicts can spiral into unthinkable violence. Commentators pointed out that suburban disputes over fences, dogs, noise, or parking can sometimes escalate when one party refuses to let go of perceived slights. But rarely did it end in such brutality. Criminologists later dissected the case as a study in catastrophic escalation. A minor irritation became magnified through repetition and fixation. Each time Amanda parked her car, Sarah interpreted it not as coincidence or oversight, but as intentional disrespect. That interpretation fed her anger, turning it into obsession. Instead of addressing her feelings rationally, she nurtured them until they burst out in violence. Prison staff who later interviewed Sarah described her as eerily calm when recounting the crime. She didn't cry, didn't express remorse. When asked if she regretted killing Amanda, she reportedly shrugged and said she should have stayed in her space. That single-minded fixation disturbed even seasoned guards who had seen hardened criminals struggle with guilt. Sarah, it seemed, never questioned the righteousness of her rage. For Amanda's community, the senselessness of her death became a lingering wound. Friends left flowers and notes on her driveway marking the very space that had sparked such deadly resentment. One note read, "This space belonged to kindness, not anger." Today, the story stands as a haunting reminder of how fragile the boundary between irritation and violence can be in the wrong mind. A car parked a few inches past a line became a trigger, a symbol, and finally a death sentence for an innocent woman. Amanda Reese lost her life not to a calculated enemy, not to a stranger seeking gain, but to a neighbor consumed by a grievance so small it was invisible to everyone but the killer. In 1998, the small farming town of Rutland, Vermont, was shaken by the death of 62-year-old Harold Jennings, a retired carpenter who lived alone in a modest home near the edge of town. Harold was well liked among his neighbors. He built porches, repaired barns, and never charged more than people could afford. A widower, he lived quietly, often seen feeding birds in his yard or tinkering in his workshop. His murder stunned the community, not only for its brutality, but for the bizarre motive that surfaced during the investigation. Harold's body was discovered by his nephew, who visited him every Saturday to help with errands. On that morning, the front door was unlocked. Inside, Harold was lying face down in the kitchen, blood pooling beneath him. He had been struck multiple times with a blunt object. The autopsy later confirmed that the weapon was likely a hammer. Detectives found no signs of forced entry, no theft. Harold's wallet and watch were untouched. The television was still on, the screen frozen in static. Whoever killed him was not a burglar. The violence seemed personal, deliberate. Suspicion quickly turned to his neighbor, 31-year-old David Carlson. David was a troubled man with a string of odd jobs and a history of disputes with nearly everyone on his street. He was known for loud arguments, petty complaints, and a reputation for being perpetually aggrieved. But what linked him to Harold was something almost too absurd to believe. Pigeons. Harold had always loved feeding birds. Every morning, he sprinkled seed across his lawn and whistled as pigeons, sparrows, and the occasional crow gathered. For him, it was a peaceful ritual. For David, it was a source of fury. He despised the birds, claiming they left droppings on his roof, cars, and even his laundry line. He complained that Harold's feeding was attracting them in droves, turning the neighborhood into a cesspool of feathers and filth. Neighbors later testified that David had shouted at Harold about the pigeons numerous times. "Stop feeding those damn things," he once yelled across the yard. Harold, polite but firm, reportedly replied, "They're just birds, Dave. Let them be." That simple difference, one man's act of kindness versus another's obsession with control, became the root of a deadly feud. On the night before the murder, a neighbor overheard the two men arguing again. David accused Harold of ruining his life with the pigeons. Harold, weary of the hostility, told him, "I've been feeding them for 20 years. I'm not stopping now." Hours later, Harold was dead. Police questioned David, who initially denied involvement, but investigators noticed scratches on his arms and flecks of blood on his shoes. Forensics matched the blood to Harold. Under pressure, David confessed. His words chilled detectives. "I killed him because he wouldn't stop feeding the birds. He chose them over me." The story spread quickly, making headlines nationwide. A man beaten to death, not for money, not for revenge, but because of pigeons. Reporters descended on Rutland, turning the quiet town into a spectacle. Some called it the bird feeder murder. At trial, prosecutors argued that David's resentment had festered until it boiled over into violence. Each time he saw Harold scatter seed, he took it as an insult, a deliberate act to torment him. On the night of the killing, fueled by alcohol and rage, he grabbed a hammer from his garage, walked into Harold's unlocked home, and bludgeoned him. It wasn't spontaneous, they said. It was obsession turned to murder. The defense painted David as a man struggling with untreated mental illness. A psychologist testified that David had paranoid delusions, convinced that Harold was feeding the pigeons specifically to antagonize him. In his distorted mind, the birds were not harmless creatures, but messengers of humiliation, a daily reminder that his neighbor was mocking him. Despite these claims, the jury found David guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. For Harold's family, the sentence brought little comfort. His nephew told reporters, "My uncle lived a simple, gentle life. He hurt no one, and he was taken from us over pigeons." How do you make sense of that? Even years later, Rutland residents speak of the case with disbelief. Some stopped feeding birds altogether, unsettled by the thought that a simple act of kindness could provoke such hatred. One neighbor, interviewed a decade later, said, "Every time I see a pigeon land on a fence, I think of Harold. He just loved them, and that love cost him his life." Inside prison, David remained unrepentant. In interviews with psychologists, he doubled down on his motive. "He disrespected me every single day with those birds," he said. "I couldn't take it anymore." When asked if Harold's death had brought him peace, David reportedly replied, "The pigeons stopped coming, didn't they?" The tragedy lies not only in Harold's death, but in the haunting realization of how fragile civility can be. A man's mourning ritual, harmless to most, became another man's torment. A clash of perspectives, one rooted in quiet joy, the other in festering resentment, led to a senseless act of violence that shattered a community. To this day, the bird feeder murder is remembered not just as a crime, but as a cautionary tale. It underscores how ordinary disputes, when left unchecked and magnified by obsession, can erupt into unthinkable brutality. Harold Jennings's life ended not at the hands of a hardened criminal, but of a neighbor who allowed pigeons to become symbols of his rage. And the chilling truth is that no one saw it coming until it was too late. In 2013, Cedar Rapids, Iowa, was not the kind of place that usually drew national headlines. A quiet, working-class city, it had a reputation for safety, family values, and a community where neighbors looked out for each other. But that image shattered in May of that year when the murder of 29-year-old Jessica Monroe was discovered in her downtown apartment. Jessica was, by all accounts, someone whose life seemed to be moving forward in all the right directions. A graphic designer at a mid-sized marketing firm, she was talented, ambitious, and well-loved by her co-workers. She had a close-knit group of friends, a fiancé she was set to marry the following spring, and a supportive family who adored her. Friends described her as vibrant, detail-oriented, and perhaps a little particular about certain things, grammar being one of them. She was known to gently point out typos in menus, misused apostrophes on billboards, and mistakes in her colleagues' internal emails. To most people, it was harmless, even endearing, but for one man, it was the beginning of an obsession that ended in tragedy. On the evening of May 17th, Jessica's fiancé, Mark, grew worried when she failed to arrive for their dinner date. Jessica was punctual by nature, and when she didn't answer her phone, his concern grew. By 8:30 p.m., he drove to her apartment, a third-floor unit in a quiet building near downtown. The front door was slightly ajar. Inside, he was confronted with chaos. Furniture overturned, a lamp shattered, papers scattered across the floor, and there, in the middle of the living room, lay Jessica. She had been strangled, the cord of her laptop charger still looped tightly around her neck. Mark immediately called 911, his voice breaking as he tried to explain what he was seeing. Police arrived within minutes and quickly secured the scene. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of burglary. Jessica's purse, wallet, and phone were all in place. Her jewelry box sat untouched on the dresser. This was not a robbery gone wrong. Whoever killed her had come with another purpose entirely. Investigators began piecing together Jessica's final hours. She had left work around 5:15 p.m., stopping at a coffee shop nearby before heading home. A neighbor reported hearing raised voices coming from her apartment around 6:30. Less than 2 hours later, Mark had arrived to find her dead. The timeline suggested a narrow window in which the killer acted. Attention soon turned to her workplace, the marketing firm where she had spent the past 5 years. Co-workers were devastated by the news, but as detectives spoke to them, one name came up again and again: Martin Hale. Martin, 34, had worked at the firm longer than Jessica, but was considered less successful. Where Jessica's creativity and attention to detail drew praise, Martin was often described as quiet, awkward, and prone to insecurity. Several colleagues mentioned that he seemed to harbor resentment toward Jessica. One even recalled him muttering that she was always trying to make him look stupid. When investigators brought Martin in for questioning, he appeared nervous but denied involvement. He claimed he had been home the entire evening working on a freelance project, but detectives had already gathered evidence that told a different story. Security cameras from a building across the street captured his car pulling up near Jessica's apartment shortly before 6:30. Forensic tests later revealed his fingerprints on Jessica's laptop. Confronted with the evidence, Martin broke down. His confession stunned even seasoned detectives. He admitted to killing Jessica not out of jealousy over her promotion, not because of any romantic entanglement, but because she always corrected his grammar in emails. To Martin, those corrections weren't innocent. In his mind, they were deliberate attempts to humiliate him in front of colleagues. Jessica, meticulous in her editing habits, often sent quick notes pointing out misplaced commas or misspelled words. She was never cruel, sometimes adding smiley faces or phrases like, "just a quick fix," but Martin took them as condescension, proof that she thought she was smarter than him. "She made me feel small," he told detectives. "Every time she corrected me, it was like she was saying I didn't belong there." The prosecution would later use his own words against him. For months, Martin had stewed over what most considered a trivial issue. Each correction became, in his mind, an insult. His resentment grew until he convinced himself Jessica was intentionally undermining him. On the night of May 17th, he decided to confront her. He drove to her apartment under the pretense of discussing a work project. When she let him in, the conversation quickly escalated. Jessica, confused, insisted she wasn't trying to embarrass him. But Martin, consumed by rage, snapped. He grabbed the nearest object, the cord from her laptop, and strangled her. The trial that followed drew national attention. The idea that a woman could be murdered over something as small as grammar corrections was both horrifying and surreal. Media outlets dubbed it the grammar murder, and the courtroom was filled with reporters eager to capture every detail. Prosecutors painted Martin as a man whose pride had curdled into obsession. They presented dozens of emails showing Jessica's corrections, always polite, always professional. They argued that Martin's interpretation of these emails revealed his fragile ego, his inability to handle even the mildest criticism. He had projected his insecurities onto Jessica, turning her kindness into malice in his own mind. The defense, meanwhile, attempted to frame Martin as mentally ill. Psychologists testified that he exhibited traits of paranoia and obsessive thought patterns. They claimed he genuinely believed Jessica was targeting him, mocking him through her corrections. In their view, the killing was not premeditated murder, but an impulsive act driven by distorted perception. But the jury was not swayed. The evidence of intent was overwhelming. His decision to go to Jessica's apartment, the confrontation, the use of the laptop cord, they found him guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. For Jessica's family, the verdict brought justice but not healing. At the sentencing hearing, her mother addressed the court. Through tears, she described her daughter as a woman who gave endlessly to others, who wanted only to help and improve the world around her. She was taken from us, her mother said, because she cared about details, because she wanted things to be right. That's who she was. And that's what cost her her life. Jessica's co-workers were left shaken, struggling with guilt. Many admitted that they had joked about her grammar corrections, warning each other to double-check emails before sending them. But none imagined it could lead to violence. One colleague broke down on the witness stand, saying, "We thought it was funny. We never thought it was dangerous." In Cedar Rapids, the case left a deep scar. It became a chilling reminder that even the most ordinary interactions can be twisted into something sinister by the wrong person. Community leaders spoke about the importance of addressing workplace tensions and mental health concerns before they escalate. The local paper ran an editorial titled "The Danger of Silent Resentment," warning that unspoken grievances, if left to fester, can explode in unimaginable ways. Inside prison, Martin Hale remains an unsettling figure. Guards reported that he spends hours writing letters with immaculate grammar and punctuation, obsessively proofing each word. To some, it is a bitter irony that the man who killed because he hated corrections now dedicates himself to perfection in writing. Whether it is remorse or fixation, no one can say. The story of Jessica Monroe endures because it defies logic. She was not killed for money or revenge or in a random act of violence. She was killed because of misplaced commas and corrected apostrophes, because one man's wounded pride transformed into lethal hatred. And so her name lives on as a tragic reminder of how fragile human relationships can be, how easily insecurity can curdle into obsession, and how a life full of promise can be stolen over something so unbelievably small.